Somewhere in the middle of a desert peninsula that most people fly over on their way to Cabo, archaeologists crawled into a cave and pulled out a cloak made from human hair. It had been sitting there, folded among stone pipes and reed whistles, for centuries. Nobody knows who wore it. Nobody knows exactly what ceremony it was part of. But historical accounts written by Spanish missionaries had described exactly this kind of object, worn by shamans during rituals that no European ever fully understood. The cloak was supposed to be a footnote in old colonial texts. Instead, it turned up physically inside a rock shelter near the Sea of Cortez, as real and as strange as anything in the archaeological record of the Americas. That is Baja California. Not the resort version, not the spring break coastline or the whale-watching brochures, the other one. The one where prehistoric miners dug underground tunnels to extract volcanic glass on a scale that nobody expected from mobile hunter-gatherers. Where enormous painted human figures, some of them taller than two men standing on each other's shoulders, stare down from canyon walls, and the oldest of them may date back 7,500 years. Where someone on a small island in the Sea of Cortez was carving grooves into pearls more than 8,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known modified pearls ever recovered from a secure archaeological context on the planet. Where a 20th century claim of a 30,000-year-old civilization had to be quietly dismantled when the evidence failed to hold. Where early coastlines used by the first Americans now sit under the ocean, and where an entire supposed ancient city evaporated the moment archaeologists actually tested the soil. 7 discoveries, each one completely different from the others, and every single one of them changes something about the way Baja California has been understood. We are starting underground. The central spine of the Baja California Peninsula is not the kind of landscape most people associate with large-scale mining. It is dry, volcanic, and isolated. Roads are scarce. Water is scarcer. The distances between settlements can stretch into hours of empty highway or dirt track. But deep inside this terrain, in an area known as Valle del Azufre, archaeologists documented something that forced a significant reconsideration of what prehistoric communities in northwestern Mexico were capable of. To understand why, you need to understand obsidian. Obsidian is volcanic glass. It forms when certain kinds of lava cool so rapidly that the atoms inside never organize themselves into crystals. The result is a smooth, glassy rock that can be fractured with extraordinary precision. A skilled knapper, someone trained in working stone, can strike or press flakes off a piece of obsidian and produce cutting edges sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. Under an electron microscope, a well-made obsidian blade has an edge measured in nanometers. Steel cannot compete at that scale. For thousands of years across the Americas, obsidian was one of the most valued raw materials a community could access. It was used for knives, scrapers, projectile points, ritual objects, and in some cultures, mirrors. The material travels well because its chemistry acts like a fingerprint. Every obsidian source has a slightly different ratio of trace elements: strontium, barium, zirconium, and others, and these ratios can be measured through techniques like X-ray fluorescence or neutron activation analysis. That means when an archaeologist finds an obsidian artifact at a site 200 kilometers from the nearest volcanic source, they can often determine exactly which geological deposit it came from. This is called obsidian sourcing, and it has revolutionized how researchers track ancient exchange networks and population movements. At Valle del Azufre, the obsidian source is not a small outcrop where people picked up a few nodules off the surface. Researchers documented more than 15 underground trenches and at least one true mining adit, an intentional horizontal passage cut into the geological deposit to follow the seam of usable material. Surrounding the trenches, they found massive quantities of discarded stone, debitage in archaeological terminology, flakes, cores, broken blanks, partially finished tools, and manufacturing debris, the accumulated waste of sustained, deliberate extraction and processing. Now, the distinction between picking up obsidian off the ground and actually mining it is critical. Natural erosion can expose volcanic glass on the surface, and in many parts of the Americas, people simply collected what geology had made available. That requires no infrastructure, no planning beyond walking to the right spot. But trenches require digging, and adit requires cutting into rock. Both require sustained physical effort, some degree of coordination, and repeated visits. The scale of debris at Valle del Azufre told researchers that this was not a place people wandered through occasionally. It was a place people returned to, worked intensively, and modified over time. The researchers who studied the site described it as the most intensively exploited known obsidian source across the broader region, encompassing the southwestern United States and northwestern Mexico. That is a significant statement. The American Southwest and northwestern Mexico contain dozens of documented obsidian sources. Some of them, Obsidian Butte in the Imperial Valley for instance, are well known in the literature. Valle del Azufre surpassed them all in terms of visible extraction effort. And this is where the discovery becomes uncomfortable for older models of Baja California's past. For much of the 20th century, the indigenous populations of the peninsula were described primarily as small, highly mobile bands of hunter-gatherers. The environment is harsh, water is limited, agriculture was not practiced in most of the peninsula before European contact. So the assumption was straightforward. People moved constantly, carried little, and left relatively modest traces. Valle del Azufre does not fit that picture. Mobile hunter-gatherers organized a mining operation that reshaped an entire geological source. They did not need cities or permanent villages to do it. They did not need agriculture. What they needed was knowledge of the landscape, skill in stoneworking, and enough social organization to return to a remote volcanic deposit and keep extracting material from underground. What remains genuinely uncertain is almost everything beyond the physical evidence. Who controlled access to the source? Was it open to anyone, or restricted by kinship, alliance, or some form of territorial agreement? How far did the finished obsidian travel? Chemical sourcing could eventually answer that question, if enough artifacts from distant sites are tested against the Valle del Azufre fingerprint. But as of the most recent published work, the full distribution network has not been mapped. We know the mine existed. We know it was enormous by regional standards. We know people worked it hard. What we do not yet know is the full human geography built around it, the relationships, obligations, and movements that connected this particular spot of volcanic glass to communities scattered across the desert. That picture, of a landscape far more complex than it appears, gets stranger the further south you go. About 400 kilometers from Valle del Azufre, the terrain drops into some of the most inaccessible canyon country in North America. The Sierra de San Francisco is a volcanic plateau slashed by deep arroyos, steep-walled gorges that can take hours or even days to reach on foot or by mule. There are no paved roads to the canyon floors. Access requires guides, permits from INAH, Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, and a willingness to descend on narrow trails that switch back down cliff faces. Inside those canyons, tucked beneath massive rock overhangs, are some of the most extraordinary paintings ever produced by any prehistoric culture anywhere on Earth. They belong to what researchers call the Grand Mural tradition. The name is not an exaggeration. These are not small images scratched into stone. They are enormous compositions, sometimes stretching across tens of meters of shelter ceiling, filled with human figures and animals painted in vivid combinations of red, black, white, and yellow pigment. Some of the human figures stand 2, 3, even 4 meters tall. They dwarf the viewer. Many are depicted with their arms raised, sometimes bisected vertically by contrasting colors, one half red, one half black. Deer, bighorn sheep, rabbits, fish, sea turtles, whales, and rays appear alongside the human forms, sometimes overlapping, sometimes painted in layers that suggest the walls were used and repainted across long stretches of time. The sheer physical difficulty of reaching these sites is one reason so many survived. Spanish missionaries who arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries recorded their existence, and local Cochimí people told the Jesuits that the paintings had been made by a race of giants who had lived in the land before them. The missionaries were skeptical, but the paintings were real, and their isolation protected them from vandalism, weathering, and development more effectively than any museum wall could have. For decades, dating the Grand Mural paintings was a significant challenge. Rock art is notoriously difficult to date because the paint itself, mineral pigments mixed with organic binders, does not always contain enough carbon for radiocarbon analysis, and even when it does, contamination from calcium carbonate deposits, microbial activity, or later paint layers can distort results. Researchers relied instead on indirect methods, dating charcoal, bone, or other organic material found in the same stratigraphic layers as fallen pigment fragments, analyzing the sequence of paint layers to establish relative chronology, and comparing the style and technology of the paintings with dated cultural phases from the broader region. What INA has reported, based on the accumulation of these different dating approaches, is that the painting tradition extends back at least roughly 7,500 years. Some individual panels may be younger, a few hundred or a few thousand years old, while others appear to belong to far earlier phases. The tradition was not a single event. It was a practice sustained across millennia, with successive generations adding to, repainting, and possibly reinterpreting the compositions left by their predecessors. 7,500 years. To put that in perspective, when the oldest of these paintings may have been applied, the Egyptian pyramids did not exist. Stonehenge had not been conceived. The cities of Mesopotamia were centuries or millennia in the future, and on a remote volcanic peninsula surrounded by desert and ocean, people were climbing into deep canyons and painting human figures the size of doorways onto rock ceilings, using pigments they had ground, mixed, and carried down cliff trails. What do the paintings mean? The honest answer is that nobody knows with certainty. The Cochimi people, who were the last indigenous inhabitants of the Sierra de San Francisco, were devastated by European diseases and missionization. Their population collapsed. Much of their oral tradition was lost. The few accounts recorded by Jesuit missionaries offer fragments, references to ceremonies, cosmological beliefs, and ritual practices, but nothing detailed enough to decode individual images. Researchers have proposed interpretations. The bisected human figures might represent duality, life and death, male and female, sky and earth. The raised arms could indicate prayer, transformation, or a ritual posture. The animals might depict species that were hunted, revered, or spiritually significant. Some scholars have suggested that at least some of the imagery relates to shamanic experience, visions, trances, or encounters with the spirit world. But these remain interpretations, built on analogy with other hunter-gatherer traditions around the world. They are plausible. They are not proven. What is proven is the scale of the commitment. People carried pigments into remote canyons, prepared surfaces, and painted compositions so large that they required scaffolding or acrobatic effort to complete. They did this not once but across thousands of years. And they did it without agriculture, without cities, without any of the infrastructure that conventional thinking once assumed was necessary for monumental symbolic expression. Here is a question worth thinking about. If you had never seen the grand mural paintings and someone described them to you, enormous figures, remote canyons, thousands of years of continuous tradition, would you have guessed they were made by small bands of desert hunter-gatherers? Or would you have assumed they required something more? Write your answer in the comments, because the gap between assumption and evidence is exactly where the most interesting archaeology happens. Now, from painted canyons to a small cave overlooking the sea, Bahia de Los Angeles sits on the eastern coast of Baja California, facing the Sea of Cortez. The water is warm, rich with marine life, and dotted with islands. The desert behind the coast is stark and dry. In a small cave near this settlement, archaeologists found a collection of objects that did not look like ordinary household equipment. The assemblage included stone pipes, reed whistles, what may have been a bull roarer, a flat, weighted object attached to a cord that produces a deep, pulsing roar when swung through the air, along with nets, feathered objects, and a garment or cloak constructed from bundles of human hair. Take those objects one at a time. Stone pipes suggest the inhalation of smoke or vapor, tobacco, datura, or other plant substances used in ritual contexts across indigenous North America. Reed whistles produce sound. A bull roarer produces a low, throbbing noise that carries over distance and is used in ceremonial contexts by cultures on multiple continents. Nets and feathered objects could serve practical purposes, but in combination with everything else, they fit more comfortably into a ritual toolkit than a fishing kit. And the cloak made from human hair is, by any standard, an extraordinary artifact. Human hair is chemically durable. It resists decay better than most organic fibers, but it is mechanically fragile. A garment made from hair bundles, surviving intact in a cave for centuries, requires exactly the kind of dry, stable, protected environment that parts of Baja California can provide. Researchers examining the fibers confirmed that they were human in origin. The construction technique involved bundling and possibly twisting the hair into cordage or strips, then assembling the strips into a garment large enough to be worn over the shoulders or around the body. Now, here is where archaeology meets history. Spanish missionaries who lived among the indigenous peoples of Baja California, particularly the Jesuits, who operated missions across the peninsula from the late 17th to the mid-18th century, recorded descriptions of ritual specialists. These accounts described individuals who performed ceremonies, communicated with the spirit world, healed the sick, and wore distinctive garments. Among the objects associated with these specialists, the missionaries specifically mentioned garments made from human hair. For decades, those descriptions existed only as text. Colonial accounts are valuable, but they are filtered through the assumptions, biases, and limited understanding of European observers who often misunderstood or deliberately distorted indigenous practices. An object described in a missionary report is not the same as an object held in your hand. The cave near Bahia de Los Angeles changed that. Here was a physical assemblage: pipes, sound-producing instruments, feathered objects, and a human hair garment that matched the written descriptions with startling specificity. Does that mean we can identify the exact person who owned these objects? No. Can we reconstruct the specific ritual they were used in? No. Can we be certain that the word shaman, a term borrowed from Siberian Tungusic languages and applied broadly across indigenous cultures worldwide, accurately describes the role of the person who wore this cloak? Not with precision. What we can say is that the combination of artifacts is consistent with a ritual specialist toolkit as described in historical sources, and that the human hair garment, previously known only from text, now exists as a physical archaeological object. The convergence is the point. When historical description and archaeological discovery align this closely, neither one is quite as uncertain as it was alone. The missionaries were not inventing the hair garments, and the cave was not an ordinary storage space. Something ceremonial, something performed, heard, seen, and worn, happened in connection with these objects. The details remain out of reach. The reality of the practice does not. From a cave on the mainland coast, we move to an island. Espiritu Santo is a long, narrow island in the southern Sea of Cortez, just north of La Paz. It is rugged, dry, and mostly uninhabited today. But it was not always so isolated. During periods of lower sea level, the channel between Espiritu Santo and the Baja California mainland was narrower, shallower, and in some reconstructions, possibly crossable on foot or by very short water crossing. The island has been used by human populations for thousands of years, and its archaeological record is remarkably rich for such a small landmass. At a site called Covacha Babisuri, a rock shelter on the island, archaeologists discovered something that, when the results were published, drew attention from specialists worldwide. They found pearls, modified pearls. Pearls with small, deliberate grooves cut into their surfaces, allowing them to be strung, suspended, or attached to clothing or the body as ornaments. Two of these pearls were directly dated using AMS radiocarbon dating. AMS stands for Accelerator Mass Spectrometry. Unlike conventional radiocarbon dating, which requires relatively large samples and measures the decay of carbon-14 by counting beta particles, AMS physically sorts individual carbon atoms by mass. This allows it to date extremely small samples, milligrams of material, with high precision. For objects like pearls, which are small, rare, and scientifically precious, AMS is often the only viable method. You cannot afford to destroy a large portion of the artifact to date it. The results place the modified pearls at approximately 8,500 years old. At the time of publication, the researchers described these as the oldest known modified pearls recovered from a securely dated archaeological context anywhere in the world. That sentence deserves unpacking. Pearls are organic. They are produced by living mollusks, and they decay. They dissolve in acidic soil. They crack in fluctuating temperatures. They crumble when handled. The vast majority of pearls that ancient people collected, admired, and wore are simply gone. Finding pearls in the archaeological record at all is unusual. Finding pearls that were intentionally modified, grooved for suspension, is rarer still. And finding them in a context where the age can be established directly through dating the associated material with AMS rather than guessed from nearby artifacts elevates the discovery to a different level entirely. The grooves themselves were examined carefully. Researchers needed to determine whether they were the result of human action or natural processes. Pearls can be scratched by sand, scored by contact with shell edges, or eroded by water movement. But the grooves on the Covacha Babasuri pearls were regular, positioned to facilitate stringing, and consistent with deliberate modification using a stone or shell tool. Natural damage produces random patterns. These grooves were functional. What does this tell us? The people living on Espiritu Santo 8,500 years ago were not merely eating shellfish and discarding the waste. They were examining what came out of the shells. They recognized that certain mollusks occasionally produced small, lustrous, rounded objects, and they valued those objects enough to modify them, to turn them into something wearable, visible, displayable. Whether the pearls signified social status, personal identity, group membership, spiritual meaning, or simply aesthetic pleasure is unknown. The evidence does not reach that far. What it does reach is the act itself. Someone, more than 8 millennia ago, sat on a dry island in the Sea of Cortez and carefully cut a groove into a pearl so it could be worn. That is thousands of years before the earliest Egyptian dynasties, thousands of years before the first Sumerian cities, and it happened on an island that most modern tourists visit only for snorkeling. If this is the kind of mystery that pulls you in, where the smallest objects carry the biggest implications, subscribe to the channel, because the deeper we go into Baja California's past, the more the conventional picture of an empty desert peninsula starts to collapse. Now we need to talk about a mistake. Not a fraud, not a lie. A mistake, the kind that science is supposed to catch, and in this case eventually did. During the 20th century, researchers working around the ancient Laguna Chapala landscape in northern Baja California recovered stone artifacts that appeared to be very, very old. The Laguna Chapala basin, during wetter climatic periods in the late Pleistocene, had held a large body of water. As the climate dried, the lake shrank and eventually disappeared, leaving behind exposed sediments and landforms that preserved traces of human activity. Stone tools, flakes, and cores were found on and around these ancient landforms. Some researchers interpreted the artifacts and their geological context as evidence for a human culture dating to approximately 30,000 to 14,000 years ago. If that chronology were correct, it would have been extraordinary. In the mid-20th century, the dominant model for the peopling of the Americas placed the earliest arrivals at roughly 13,000 years ago, via the Bering Land Bridge. A 30,000-year-old culture in Baja California would have shattered that timeline. It would have implied that people reached the peninsula, either overland or by coastal migration, far earlier than anyone in the mainstream scientific community was prepared to accept. The claim generated attention. It appeared in publications. It became part of the broader, often heated debate about when humans first entered the Americas. But there were problems. Many of the artifacts had been collected from the surface, not excavated from sealed, undisturbed deposits. Surface finds are inherently difficult to date because objects on the surface can move. Wind, water, gravity, animal activity, and even foot traffic can transport artifacts from one sedimentary context to another. A stone tool lying on a surface that formed 30,000 years ago is not necessarily 30,000 years old. It could have been dropped there last week. Dating techniques available in the mid-20th century were also less precise, and, critically, the association between artifacts and dated geological layers was not always established with the rigor that later standards would demand. When archaeologists returned to the Laguna Chapala area with better methods, the picture changed. At a site called Abrigo Paredon, a rock shelter, controlled excavation produced a genuine stoneworking complex embedded in a stratigraphic sequence. Charcoal and organic material from the deposit were radiocarbon dated. The results came back at roughly 9,000 radiocarbon years ago. That is old. That is genuinely early. But it is not 30,000. In 2026, INA specifically addressed the older claims, emphasizing that the dramatically early chronology associated with the Laguna Chapala Basin cannot be accepted as established evidence. The artifacts are real, the human presence is real, but the extreme age that had once been proposed simply does not hold up under modern standards of excavation, dating, and stratigraphic control. This is not a story of scientific failure, it is a story of scientific correction. Early researchers worked with the tools and frameworks available to them. They made observations, proposed interpretations, and published their conclusions. Later researchers tested those conclusions with better tools and found them wanting. That process, hypothesis, test, revision, is not a weakness, it is the entire point. And it matters because the corrected version of Laguna Chapala is still important. 9,000 years of occupation, specialized stone production, and a long relationship between human communities and a changing desert landscape. That is a significant archaeological record. What it is not is 30,000 years old. The temptation in popular science is always to reach for the most spectacular number. Sometimes the most responsible conclusion is less dramatic and much more solid. From landscapes that archaeology had to redate, we move to landscapes that archaeology can barely reach at all. The coastline of Baja California today is not the coastline that the first human inhabitants knew. During the last ice age, enormous volumes of water were locked in continental glaciers. Global sea levels were lower. At the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, the ocean surface stood as much as 120 to 130 meters below its present level. That is a staggering amount of land now underwater. Entire continental shelves that are submerged today were exposed, dry, walkable terrain. For the early coastal populations of Baja California, this means that the beaches, tidal flats, estuaries, and nearshore zones they relied on, the places where they would have gathered shellfish, launched boats, set up camps, processed marine resources, and lived significant portions of their lives, no longer exist above water. As glaciers melted and sea levels rose through the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, roughly between 15,000 and 6,000 years ago, those landscapes were progressively drowned. Around Espiritu Santo Island, underwater surveys have documented cultural material on surfaces that are now submerged beneath the Sea of Cortez. This is not the discovery of a sunken city. There are no walls, no streets, no monumental architecture sitting on the seafloor. What there is evidence of human activity on what used to be dry land, stone artifacts, shell concentrations, and other traces that indicate people once occupied or used terrain that the ocean has since claimed. How do underwater archaeologists distinguish a drowned terrestrial site from objects simply lost overboard from a canoe? Several lines of evidence converge. The artifacts sit on or within sediment layers that show characteristics of subaerial deposition. They formed in air, not underwater. The spatial patterning of materials can resemble campsites rather than random scatter. The types of artifacts found, stone tools, processing debris, hearth-like concentrations, are consistent with land-based activity, not maritime loss. And the depth and location of the finds correspond to the positions of reconstructed paleo shorelines, the ancient coastlines modeled by combining sea level curves with bathymetric and geological data. Paleo shoreline reconstruction is itself a powerful tool. Researchers use records of global and regional sea level change, derived from coral terraces, sediment cores, and oxygen isotope ratios, and overlay those curves onto detailed maps of the underwater topography. The result is a series of estimated coastlines for different time slices, where the shore stood 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. Each successive coastline is closer to the modern one as the water rose, and each earlier coastline is farther out, on terrain that is now submerged. The implication for Baja California's archaeology is profound and uncomfortable. If the earliest coastal populations of the peninsula lived along shorelines that no longer exist above water, then a substantial portion of the earliest archaeological record is, by definition, inaccessible to conventional land-based survey. Archaeologists searching for the first coastal inhabitants of Baja California by walking today's beaches are looking in the wrong place. They are looking at a coastline that did not exist when those people were alive. This is not a theoretical concern, it is a documented one. Cultural material has been found on drowned landscapes around Espiritu Santo. That means the archaeological record of early Baja California is not simply thin because few people lived there, or because preservation is poor, or because researchers have not looked hard enough. It is thin in part because significant portions of it are underwater. The challenge is enormous. Underwater archaeological survey is expensive, technically demanding, and limited by visibility, currents, depth, and the sheer scale of the areas involved. The submerged shelves around Baja California stretch for hundreds of kilometers. Systematically surveying all of that terrain is currently beyond the resources of any single institution. But the principle has been established. The early coastal archaeology of the peninsula does not stop at the waterline. It continues beneath it. And that fact alone should change the way we think about what has been found and what has been lost. We end with a disappearance, not of an artifact, not of a people, but of an entire ancient city. In northern Baja California, near a locality called Macahui, researchers noticed something striking on the desert surface. Scattered across the landscape were numerous cleared circular areas, rings of bare or compacted ground surrounded by undisturbed desert pavement. The circles were regular, they were numerous, and they were large enough and arranged densely enough to suggest that something significant had once occupied this stretch of desert. The interpretations escalated quickly. At various points, the circles were described as the remains of a massive prehistoric settlement. Others suggested a ceremonial center. Some went further and proposed an enormous ancient cemetery. The visual evidence was persuasive. Seen from above, or at ground level, the circles looked deliberate, organized, and old. Popular accounts and some early scholarly references treated Macahui as evidence for a level of urbanization or social complexity in Baja California that had never been documented before. Then, archaeologists investigated the site systematically, and the enormous ancient city disappeared. What researchers found when they tested the circles against the physical evidence was far less dramatic. A significant portion of the circular clearings had been created through ordinary, relatively recent activities, specifically gravel collection and surface clearing. In the arid environment of northern Baja California, where vegetation is sparse and the surface is covered by a layer of small stones and gravel known as desert pavement, removing gravel for construction, road building, or other practical purposes leaves behind a visible circular depression or cleared patch. Over time, as the surrounding desert pavement weathers and darkens, the contrast between the cleared spots and the undisturbed surface becomes more pronounced. The circles look older and more intentional than they are. How did archaeologists reach that conclusion? Several kinds of evidence converged. First, the cleared areas did not contain the artifact densities you would expect from a major settlement. A real prehistoric town or ceremonial center would leave behind enormous quantities of broken pottery, stone tools, food remains, ash, and structural debris. The circles did not. Second, there was no architecture, no post holes, no wall foundations, no floor surfaces. Third, no hearths, fire-cracked rock, or cooking features were identified in systematic association with the circles. Fourth, the soil within the circles showed disturbance patterns consistent with mechanical removal of the surface layer rather than long-term human occupation. And fifth, historical land use records and local knowledge pointed to gravel extraction as a known activity in the area. None of this means that Macahui has no archaeological significance whatsoever. Northern Baja California has a rich and genuine prehistoric record. People lived in this landscape for thousands of years, and real sites with real artifacts exist throughout the region. But the specific claim that the circular clearings represented a huge ancient complex did not survive systematic testing. This is worth pausing on because the Macahui story illustrates something important about how archaeology actually works. A strange pattern is noticed. A hypothesis develops, sometimes cautiously, sometimes extravagantly. The hypothesis enters popular circulation, and then, if the system works the way it should, researchers go back to the ground and test the claim against physical evidence. At Macahui, the physical evidence said no. The circles were not ancient structures. They were modern disturbances made visually dramatic by the desert environment. The correction is not exciting in the way the original claim was exciting. Nobody makes a documentary about gravel pits, but the correction is arguably more valuable than the claim. It demonstrates that archaeology is not in the business of collecting mysteries. It is in the business of resolving them. and sometimes resolving a mystery means showing that it was never a mystery at all. If you found this video worth your time, if the real archaeology of Baja California surprised you as much as any fiction could, share it with someone who still thinks the peninsula is nothing but resorts and desert. And ask yourself this: how many other places on Earth are hiding a record this strange, this layered, and this poorly known, simply because nobody thought to look? 7 discoveries, 1 peninsula, an obsidian mine that rivals anything in the American Southwest, operated by people who are still described in textbooks as simple wandering bands. Painted figures the height of basketball hoops, staring down from canyon walls for 7 millennia. A cloak made from human hair, matching descriptions that missionaries wrote down 300 years ago. Pearls grooved for stringing, 8,500 years old, from an island most people visit for a single afternoon. A 30,000-year-old civilization claim that collapsed under better evidence, and left behind a 9,000-year-old record that is impressive enough on its own. Coastlines where early people lived, now drowned beneath the Sea of Cortez. And a massive ancient city that turned out to be a gravel operation. None of these stories required aliens. None of them required lost civilizations or transoceanic visitors. What they required was attention. The willingness to look at a peninsula most people dismiss as empty, and to ask what is actually in the ground, on the walls, inside the caves, under the water, and on the surface of the desert. Baja California is not empty. It never was. The strangeness is real. And the archaeology, patient, careful, sometimes spectacular, sometimes deflating, is only beginning to catch up with it.